Everyone hears the phrase "dam emergency" and thinks the same thing: too much rain, too much snowmelt, too much water. Right now, in the shadowed valleys of the Monashi Mountains of British Columbia, the water is rising toward the final evacuation trigger. It is Wednesday, April 15, 2026. While the hydroelectric generation station that could help move more of it out is not running. At the Sentinel Dam complex, there is already a published protocol for what happens as the reservoir climbs against the concrete. At 30 centimeters from the crest, residents in the downstream valley start packing. At 15 centimeters, they prepare to leave. At 2.5 centimeters, the evacuation order for the entire Columbia River corridor below the canyon goes out. As of 8 a.m. this morning, the water was exactly 38 centimeters from the crest. The dam is moving toward its evacuation threshold, while the very system designed to relieve that pressure, the 4 massive Francis turbines of the powerhouse, is offline. From a distance, this looks like the usual Canadian spring emergency. Record snowpack in the Selkirks, 3 days of unseasonably warm atmospheric river rainfall, and water levels surging across the interior. Emergency Management BC has activated the Provincial Emergency Coordination Center. Sandbags are being stacked in Revelstoke and Castlegar, pumps are screaming, crews are clearing debris from intake grates. Officials are telling the public the situation is serious, but the data suggests it is worse than serious. It is systemic. The Sentinel complex is not just the spillway and the gates, it is a coupled machine. Right beside the Crown-managed spillway sits the privately operated North Flow generation station. And that station matters for one simple reason: it moves water. In an emergency like this, moving water is not a side issue. It is the entire objective. But as of April 12th, that generation station ceased operation. Technicians reported a structural misalignment in the turbine shafts, a physical shift in the bedrock that has jammed the mechanical heart of the dam. Natural Resources Canada has been monitoring a series of harmonic tremors beneath the reservoir for 72 hours. When officials say they are pushing through as much water as they can, they are speaking a partial truth. They are pushing as much as the surviving spillway gates can handle, but without the turbines, the dam is effectively strangled. It is fighting a 1 in 100 year flood event with only 60% of its designed outflow capacity. This is not a dam taking on too much water. It is a dam whose escape valves have been welded shut by the earth itself. The real question is no longer how much rain fell. The real question is how much usable margin is left when the ground is shifting and the clocks are out of sync. At 4:12 a.m. on April 12, 2026, the first warning didn't come from the water level sensors or the gate operators at Sentinel Dam. It came from the Canadian National Seismograph Network (CNSN) station 22 kilometers to the west. A magnitude 3.4 seismic event, sharp and shallow, rippled through the Shuswap metamorphic complex. To the public, it was a minor tremor, barely a vibration in the floorboards of homes in the Kootenays. To the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, it was the sound of the Earth's internal clock accelerating. What scientists saw in the last weeks of data changes everything. This is not a slow seasonal adjustment. It is a catastrophic convergence of hydrostatic pressure and tectonic instability happening in real time. By 11:30 p.m. on April 13th, Natural Resources Canada's GNSS stations, part of the Canadian Active Control System, began reporting a terrifying anomaly. Station BC-SEN1, located on the dam's western abutment, showed a horizontal offset of 11.4 centimeters toward the south-southwest. In the world of dam safety, 11 centimeters of crustal movement is not settling. It is a structural amputation. The mechanism is a phenomenon known as reservoir-induced seismicity, but on a scale the Canadian Cordillera has rarely witnessed. For 3 decades, the weight of the water behind the Sentinel Dam has been pressing down on the Purcell Trench fault system. Normally, the friction holds. But the spring of 2026 brought a record-shattering snowpack to the Selkirks, followed by a heat dome event that triggered an instantaneous, violent melt. Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, reported that the reservoir inflow spiked by 400% in 48 hours. As the water level climbed to within 40 centimeters of the crest, the sheer mass of the reservoir began forcing water deep into the microfractures of the bedrock. This is pore pressure diffusion. The water acts as a lubricant, unzipping the fault plains 10 kilometers below the surface. At 9:15 a.m. on April 14th, seismographs at the University of British Columbia's monitoring station recorded a sustained harmonic tremor, a rhythmic low-frequency pulse typically associated with magma movement, or in this case, the rapid migration of pressurized fluids through a failing rock mass. The data is unequivocal, states Dr. Alistair McTeer, a senior seismologist with the GSC. We aren't just looking at a flood. We are looking at a tectonic response to a hydrological extreme. The ground is literally moving out from under the infrastructure. This geophysical shift is exactly why the North Flow hydroelectric station went dark. The powerhouse and the spillway are anchored into 2 different rock blocks, separated by a secondary shear zone. As the western block shifted 11 centimeters, the massive steel shafts of the Francis turbines, each weighing hundreds of tons, were forced into a lethal misalignment. By the afternoon of April 14th, the bearings began to smoke. The automated safety systems tripped. The turbines, which could have been venting 1,200 cubic meters of water per second, ground to a halt. The pressure is now focused entirely on the concrete spillway. But there is a hidden danger in the data. While the surface water rises toward the evacuation trigger of 2.5 centimeters, the internal uplift pressure within the dam's foundation is climbing even faster. Piezometers, sensors that measure water pressure inside the concrete, are showing readings that exceed the dam's design basis earthquake tolerances. At 2 p.m. on April 15, 2026, the differential between the reservoir weight and the internal uplift reached a critical tipping point. The dam is no longer a static wall. It is a pressurized vessel under tectonic torsion. Every millimeter of additional rain falling over the Monashi watershed increases the shear stress on a foundation that is already moving. The clock isn't just ticking for the people downstream in the Columbia Valley. It is ticking for the integrity of the Canadian Interior's power grid. If the Sentinel falls, the surge won't just be water. It will be a 15-meter wall of debris traveling at 60 kilometers per hour toward every bridge, rail hub, and town site between the canyon and the border. The system is coupled, the pressure is rising, and the ground has already begun to give way. Canada already knows what it looks like when a water control system loses its margin. We have seen this before, and the scars are still visible on the landscape of Quebec and Alberta. That is why the 1996 Saguenay flood matters here, not because the Sentinel Dam is failing in the exact same way, but because Canada has already lived through a disaster where rising water, unforeseen infrastructure limits, and a sudden loss of operational control met in the same place. In July 1996, the Saguenay region was hit by a weather bomb that dropped 290 millimeters of rain in 36 hours. The Kenagami Reservoir, much like the reservoir behind Sentinel today, reached its limit. As the water overtopped the dikes and the small dams of the region, it didn't just flood, it transformed. It carved new canyons through solid earth, displaced 16,000 people, and cost over 1.5 billion Canadian dollars in damages. The forensic conclusion from the Commission of Inquiry used a term that now haunts the British Columbia interior: morphological instability. The science of dam safety in Canada is built around the concept of the probable maximum flood, PMF, the theoretical limit of what a watershed can produce. But in the spring of 2026, the PMF is being rewritten in real time by a climate that is no longer behaving according to historical cycles. At Sentinel, the current inflow is calculated at KEN approximately 8,500 cubic meters per second. The outflow through the spillways hampered by debris and the offline north flow station is only count approximately equals 5,200 cubic meters per second. This creates a volume accumulation rate of dTdV equals Q in minus Q out, a positive delta, that translates to a vertical rise of 2.2 centimeters per hour. In a system where the evacuation trigger is measured in single digits, this is a terminal velocity. The twist in the geophysical analysis of the Sentinel crisis is the coupling of this hydraulic mass with the underlying tectonic stress of the Rocky Mountain Trench. As the reservoir weight increases, it exerts a downward force Fg that increases the shear stress on the Purcell Fault. According to a 2025 technical report by Natural Resources Canada, the regional crustal loading has reached a point where the factor of safety, Fs, for the dam's foundation has dropped below 1.1. In engineering terms, a factor of 1.0 is failure. We are operating on a 10% margin of error. Tau F equals C plus sigma n tangent of phi. The Moore Coulomb failure criterion represented above explains the nightmare facing the GSC scientists today. As the pore water pressure mu increases due to the reservoir depth, the effective normal stress sigma n decreases. When the effective stress drops, the shear strength of the rock, tau f, vanishes. The dam isn't just being pushed over by the water, it is being lifted up by the very fluid it is trying to contain. This is uplift pressure, and it is the silent killer of gravity dams. History tells us that infrastructure failure is rarely about a single event. It is about the cascading failure of coupled systems. In 2013, during the southern Alberta floods, the collapse of a single rail bridge in Calgary nearly compromised the entire downtown utility corridor. At Sentinel, the coupling is even more direct. If the western abutment shifts another 4 centimeters, the emergency spillway gates, the only remaining outflow path, could jam in their tracks. This would effectively lock the reservoir. The inflow would continue unabated, and the dam would transition from a controlled hydraulic structure to a 150-meter high concrete weir. The Geological Survey of Canada's regional models suggest that we are entering a period of tectonic hydrologic synchronicity. The melting of the Canadian permafrost and the heavier than normal snowpacks are not just surface issues. They are changing the mass distribution of the North American plate. The Sentinel Dam is the canary in the coal mine for this new era. The protocol of 30, 15, and 2.5 centimeters assumes a world where the dam stays still while the water moves. But when the ground is moving faster than the water is rising, the protocol is a relic of a climate that no longer exists. The margin is shrinking, the clocks are diverging, and the historical parallels suggest that once a system enters the state of nonlinear response, the window for intervention is already closed. The numbers on a seismograph or a pressure gauge are clinical, but on the ground in the Columbia Valley, they translate into a frantic, high-stakes choreography of survival. At 9:30 a.m., as the water at the Sentinel Dam crest reached the 35-centimeter mark, the Provincial Emergency Coordination Center in Saanich issued a broadcast intrusive alert across the entire southern interior. Every smartphone from Golden to Trail screamed with the emergency tone. For Marcus Tremblay, a senior turbine technician who has spent 24 years at the North Flow station, the emergency didn't start with a phone alert. It started with a sound he describes as the earth screaming through a megaphone. Tremblay was in the lower gallery of the powerhouse when the structural misalignment occurred. You don't just hear a turbine shaft fail, he says in a recorded interview with Emergency Management BC. You feel it in your teeth. The floor began to tilt. Not a vibration, but a genuine, slow motion least to the south. Then came the smell, ozone and vaporized bearing grease. When the safety breakers blew, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. That was the moment I realized that dam was no longer a machine we controlled. It had become a geological event. Tremblay and his team are now working in a high-risk environment, attempting to manually crack the auxiliary bypass valves. They are working in a subterranean structure that is physically twisting. The concrete is groaning, Tremblay notes. Every few minutes you hear a crack, like a gunshot, echoing through the galleries. That's the reinforcement steel snapping under the tension. Downstream, the logistical nightmare is unfolding. Constable Anika Dalival of the RCMP is coordinating the evacuation of Sentinel Creek, a town of 4,200 people sitting directly in the inundation path. The evacuation is not just a matter of moving people, it is a battle against geography. Highway 1, the Trans-Canada Highway, is the primary artery, and it is already choked with traffic and mudslides. We have families in the Kootenays who have been through floods before, but this is different, Dalival reports. The speed of the rise is unprecedented. We are seeing water where there has been no water for 10,000 years. By noon, the RCMP had begun tactical evacuations using CH-146 Griffon helicopters from the Canadian Armed Forces base in Edmonton, tasked to lift elderly residents from the isolated benches above the river. The cost of this operation is mounting. Initial estimates from Public Safety Canada suggest the economic impact of a failure at Sentinel would exceed 6.8 billion Canadian dollars, accounting for the destruction of the CPKC rail corridor, 3 major bridge crossings, and the total loss of the North Flow generation capacity. In Kelowna at the Regional Monitoring Hub, Dr. Sarah Choi of the Geological Survey of Canada stares at a screen that should be impossible. The GNSS data from the dam's crest is now showing stick-slip behavior. The dam is moving in sudden millimeter-scale jerks. This is exactly what we see in subduction zone modeling, Choi explains to the provincial cabinet via secure link. The reservoir is acting as a hydraulic jack. Every time the water rises another centimeter, it forces the Purcell fault to slip. We are essentially watching a man-made earthquake being triggered in slow motion. Choi's team is tracking a weak layer of weathered schist 40 meters below the dam's foundation. If that layer liquefies under the current pore pressure, the entire 2.2 million ton concrete monolith will slide downstream. It's not a question of the concrete breaking, she says. It's a question of the ground failing. You can't send back a tectonic fault. The impact on the BC hydrogrid is already being felt. With North Flow offline and the interties to the Alberta grid under strain, rolling brownouts have begun in the lower mainland. The loss of 800 megawatts of firm power at a time when heating demand is high due to the unseasonable storm is a systemic shock. Telecommunications are also flickering. 3 major TELUS microwave towers are located on ridges that are currently experiencing slope creep due to the saturated soils. If those towers go, the evacuation zone loses its ability to receive real-time updates. On the banks of the river, the story is told in personal losses. Jean-Baptiste Lavoie, a 5th-generation rancher whose land has been in his family since the 1890s, watched as his lower north pasture disappeared under 2 meters of silt in 4 hours. The river didn't just rise, it expanded, Lavoie says, standing by his loaded truck. It's taken the trees, the soil, everything. My grandfather told me about the big water in 1948, but he never saw the ground move like this. The mountain is coming down to meet the river. As the sun begins to set on April 15th, the gap between the water and the crest has shrunk to 18 centimeters. The North Flow station remains a dark, groaning tomb of machinery. The pumps are still running. The sandbags are still being stacked by exhausted volunteers in Revelstoke, and the press releases continue to use the word manageable. But the data doesn't lie. The margin is a phantom. In the command centers, the conversation has shifted from prevention to recovery. The infrastructure of the 20th century is being systematically dismantled by the physics of the 21st. And for the thousands of Canadians in the shadow of the Sentinel, the clock is no longer ticking. It is accelerating towards zero. As the midnight hour approaches on April 15, 2026, the Sentinel Dam stands as a monument to a fading era of engineering certainty. Even if the crest is not breached tonight, the data suggests the damage is already permanent. The 11.4 centimeters of crustal shift recorded by Natural Resources Canada is not a temporary flex. It is a fundamental reordering of the Purcell Trench's geomechanical state. In the months and years to follow, the Sentinel event will be studied as the moment the Canadian Cordillera transitioned into a period of heightened tectonic hydrologic synchronicity. The future risks are no longer theoretical. By the spring of 2027, the residual stress stored within the dam's concrete monolith, estimated at over 15 megapascals of internal tension, will likely lead to autogenous healing failure, where the internal chemistry of the concrete can no longer bridge the widening microfissures. This isn't just about one dam. The Sentinel is the linchpin of the Upper Columbia system. If its structural integrity remains compromised, the downstream pressures on the Revelstoke and Hugh Kinley side dams become untenable. We are looking at a step change in the risk profile for the entire British Columbia hydroelectric grid. The vulnerability of Canada's vital corridors is the next chapter of this crisis. The CPKC rail lines, which carry billions of dollars in grain, potash and coal to the port of Vancouver, run through the very canyons most susceptible to the slope creep triggered by these seismic shifts. A 2026 risk assessment by Public Safety Canada warns that a failure of the Sentinel secondary dikes would not only sever the rail link, but would also take out sections of Highway 1, effectively isolating the west coast from the rest of the country for months. The economic hemorrhage would be felt from the Halifax shipyards to the Calgary towers. This is the reality of a coupled system. A failure in a remote mountain canyon dictates the price of bread in Toronto. Beyond the immediate structural concerns, the new normal involves the deep-seated magma reservoirs of the Anaheim volcanic belt and their relationship to regional crustal loading. While the Monashis are not volcanic, the massive redistribution of water weight, billions of tons of meltwater moving from peaks to reservoirs, creates flexural loading that can trigger distant faults. Scientists at the University of British Columbia are already modeling a domino scenario where the instability at Sentinel propagates southward towards the more populous regions of the Okanagan and the Fraser Valley. The infrastructure we built in the 1950s and 60s was designed for a static world. We now live in a kinetic one. The environmental fallout is equally staggering. The Columbia River system is a delicate ecological artery. A sudden release of sediment-heavy water from a structural failure at Sentinel would effectively scour the spawning beds of the white sturgeon and the remaining kokanee salmon populations, resetting an ecosystem that has taken 10,000 years to stabilize. The 1.2 billion Canadian dollars invested in habitat restoration over the last decade could be erased in a single afternoon of morphological instability. As we look towards the late 2020s, the story of the Sentinel will be the story of the gap, the widening void between what nature is doing in real time and what our machinery can actually do in response. We have two clocks. One clock is the water, driven by atmospheric rivers and melting glaciers. The other is the system, driven by regulatory approvals, aging turbines, and manual bypass valves. These clocks are moving at different speeds, and the gap between them is where disasters live. At Sheboygan, at Edenville, and now at the Sentinel, the lesson is the same. The margin is an illusion. When the water is 2.5 centimeters from the edge, and the ground beneath the dam has already moved 11 centimeters, the protocol is just a way to count down the end. The real story of 2026 is not just a sprint flood. It is a question of usable capacity, timing, and the terrifying physics of a planet that is no longer content to stay still. The water is still rising. The North Flow hydroelectric station is still dark. The technicians are still in the galleries, listening to the concrete snap, and the margin is still shrinking. The disaster doesn't always start with a bang. Sometimes it starts with a 3.4 magnitude tremor and a turbine that refuses to turn. This is the reality of the Canadian interior. This is the cost of the new geology. Follow the data, because the water doesn't wait for the machinery to catch up. If this story is worth telling, subscribe. We cover more of this every week.